Now, I'm a firm believer that personal preference ultimately will dictate what size watch will work for you. You can't really follow anybody's perfect formula for the perfect watch size for your wrist. It comes down to personal preference. But let's face it, not all watches work on our wrists, or maybe don't fit the way that we would like them, whether too small or too big. So in this video, what I want to look at is some watches that have high viability on many different wrists, or the majority of wrists, and can be pulled off to fit most people out there. And just for this video, I want to stress again, personal preference will dictate this more than anything. My criteria here is that if somebody wanted to look at one of these watches and wanted to pull it off, could it be pulled off in the majority of scenarios? Say like 80% of wrists out there, could they pull this off if they wanted to? That would be my judgment for this video. Just to be clear as well, we're looking at specific models and not model families, so different sizes. We're trying to zero in on one watch size, one style that could work for many different people out there. And I know this is very specific, but the goal here is to showcase some watches that might be an easy suggestion for those that are concerned about this idea of maybe being able to pull something off, and just looking at watches that are in kind of that Goldilocks zone or have this unique trait about them that allows them to be worn by a wide variety of people. Also, if you're interested in this topic a little bit more, I have tried to break this down further into an article talking about watch size versus wrist size. We go through a lot of different ideas, talking about preferences, lug to lug and its importance, dial to bezel ratios and how that impacts wearing. And we also have a video on this article, it'll be in the description down below, where we show different watch sizes on different wrists so you can get a sense of scale and how different watches might wear depending on your own wrist size at home. Check that out, link will be in the description down below. And for this video, we're gonna be breaking this down into different categories, wide variety of price ranges within each one of these categories. So we're trying to just look at all different segments of the market and where are some of the highlights. Now to kick us off, we'll go for the everyday category, and the watch that I wanna showcase here and talk about is the G-Shock DW5600, this case specifically. There is not one other G-Shock to me that epitomizes this idea as being so universal in its size and being able to be pulled off by pretty much anybody out there. Of course, some people will think it's too small, but 42.8 millimeters in a pretty compact case, it still has presence. Also, there's an element of the resin case and just how you perceive a digital watch on wrist. It makes this watch just work for so many people. It feels right. It looks great on somebody that has a very large wrist, but also looks great on somebody that has a smaller wrist as well. Another reason why I wanted to showcase this watch is it represents a style that is completely its own and set the standard for really what this is for digital watches, which is that Goldilocks zone of being viable for many people, the same way, say, like a Rolex case for Submariner set the same stage in like the mid 20th century for its respective category. Some people might argue with me on this one, but I'm going to put the Seiko Alpinist SPB 121 on this list. This is a piece that I deal with a lot because we are an authorized dealer of Seiko, and I get so many good just points of feedback about this watch and how it wears. It's a little weird because you have that compass bezel, the additional crown. It's not conventional by any means, but because it has unique crown position, it creates a appearance on wrist that is larger for those that want a larger watch, but also doesn't have this overhang effect because it's not adding anything to that lug to lug dimension. It's a 39.5 millimeter case, but a 46 millimeter lug to lug is very forgiving. 200 meters of water resistance. It's a watch I think many people will be happy with, and it's a successor to the SARB 017, which was a cult classic and a fan favorite for many years. Another watch I want to put on this list is the Sinn 104, and I'm speaking from personal experience. I think this is a watch that can work for so many people. I own the Sinn 556. That watch, I could see some saying that's too small. The 41 millimeter case on the 104 is a tricky one because you hear that and you're like, oh, that might be too big for some people. Maybe it's too small for others, but it wears like a dream. Even on my smaller wrist, I remember having this watch and I never felt like it was too big for me. It has this broken down, have the bezel with the dial, and that was definitely helping it. But then you had a compact lug to lug, pretty reasonable thickness as well at 11.9 millimeters, while still getting 200 meters of water resistance, which was always crazy to me. One thing I've noticed is the way that the H-link drapes around the wrist. It's very forgiving for those that maybe are trying to pull something off. It wears it more exact to that lug-to-lug dimension, and the positioning of the holes within the lugs themselves for a strap are seated slightly higher than maybe normal or some watches out there, so that also gives a benefit. Love how this watch wears. Probably one of the most wearable and versatile 41mm cases in all of watchmaking. For our next watch, we're going to look at what I would say is the most wearable Grand Seiko case for the majority of people out there. People love the Snowflake. I think for some, it might be too large. Where I would find the happy medium was something with the 62GS case. So this is the SBGA 413. It's right on 40mm in case size. Lug to lug is forgiving at 46.5mm. It's probably one of my favorite Grand Seikos, easily in my top 3 to 5. It's up there. I love and adore this dial. It's simply stunning. And it sounds like that is also the case for many other people out there, because I was informed that this is basically right in the running with the Snowflake in terms of a bestseller for the brand. Reasonable thickness at 12.8mm, spring drive movement on the inside. And with this lugs and how they are constructed, you also have the slight little lip underneath the 6 o'clock side and 12 o'clock side, where it just creates this nice central casing and optics when looking at the watch on wrist, where it just looks at home and doesn't have this curvaceous nature that some Grand Seiko cases can have. And then to close out the everyday category, Royal Oaks are not very wearable. I mean, for most people out there, I would say that they are going to be large. And I was thinking about whether or not to put this on the list here, but I decided to, and this is the AP Jumbo 16202 ST. So this is the latest iteration of the Jumbo, celebrating 50 years. It is a watch that at the lug-to-lug dimension is around like 48mm. So it's not a small watch, but 39mm case. The bracelet, yes, is going to add to that length dimension because they are stiff. If you ever handle the Royal Oak bracelet, that doesn't drape as much as some other bracelets out there. But all in all, I think this is, if you're talking about the most versatile case size of one of the most iconic watches of all time, this is probably in the sweet spot for case and wear. In addition, the thickness of the watch at 8.1mm also helps its case. Next, we shift into dive style. And the reason I want to say dive style is because the first watch here probably didn't fit in the category of dive watch. I know the pitchforks would be going if I included this. And I struggled to think about which Seiko 5 would be the most versatile. And I know some people are gonna say, oh, let's go for like the Dress KX, those models that are closer to 38mm in case size. Not this watch, but I actually think this is the most wearable for the vast majority of wrists out there. If somebody has a medium sized wrist or even slightly smaller, larger, this would be the option I would recommend. This is the SRPD collection, so the traditional 5KX model family, or however people would like to call it. But the 42.5mm SKX case, and there's a reason why the SKX was so beloved. And the reason was, for one, it was, since 1996, this diving icon, ISO compliant dive watch, which this watch is not that. But it does offer up the same other charm that the SKX offered up, which was its case and wearability. It just had this effect, and if you've ever worn any Seiko watches, or dive watches specifically, they wear much more compact than the case size would indicate. I find that some of like the Dress KXs, for people out there, they're just too small. I mean, we hear that all the time from customers saying that, hey, like, you know, it's a little small for me, less and less now because of just the norms of what people want. But when you see 42.5mm, you're like, no way, I can't pull this off. But trust me, if you're somebody that doesn't mind having something that's a little bit larger on wrist, but it's not, you know, so large, you just want a nice substantial watch, you want something that wears maybe closer to a 40.5mm in case size, which I think is a nice Goldilocks zone case size for many people. I think these are very viable for a wide variety of wrists. I know some people are going to argue with me on this. Just my opinion, I think these are really versatile in terms of their case. Next, we have the Oris Aquis, and I'm going to pick one of the sizes, and that is going to be 41.5. Some of you are gonna say, 41.5, what are you thinking? Are you serious? The reason why 41.5, because I find that all the Aquis models wear like a millimeter to a millimeter and a half smaller. So if I'm trying to pick the best size for the widest variety of wrists out there, I would go for the Aquis 41.5, because lug to lug is 48. It wears pretty much precisely to that lug-to-lug dimension because of the integrated bracelet. They don't have this male end link at that point where it meets the bracelet too, so it's very forgiving at that end, making this wear more compact on wrist. How I would look at it, 43.5 wears like a 42, 41.5 wears like a conventional 40, and then like a 39.5, for example, would wear closer to that of like a 38mm dive watch. So depends where you're at, but that's for the Aquis, the tricky thing with the sizing and trying to get that right. One area of this video where I spent a good amount of time going back and forth, what is the watch that I would pick from Tudor from the dive watch category that could fit this mold of being the most viable for many wrists out there? I thought about the 58, but I also know there's so many people that think the 58 is a small watch. It does not suit a larger wrist very well, and it looks very dainty. So there's a large vocal crowd that believes that, and I think with the 54, that conversation may have just become a bit more involved in how people look at the 58. There is also a little bit of that collective type of contrarian effect where if a lot of people like something, people want to talk about it in a certain way. That happens a lot in watch collecting. But I'm gonna go with the Tudor Pelagos 39. For a couple of reasons. One, titanium. Titanium is going to help, I think, in making it a lightweight experience without really taking away from the visual appearance on wrist. 39mm, but the bezel and how it is thicker does create a more bolstered effect that adds more of an imposing demeanor when strapped to the wrist. There's something about the Black Bay that has more of an elegant approach. It's, more heritage inspired. The Pelagos is more unabashed in its ability just to try to be a modern dive watch, which I think for people that have larger wrists, that's more viable, and that's why I would look at the 39 as maybe being the consideration here. So this would be the choice for maybe the most versatile Tudor dive watch in my opinion, at least when you're talking about wrist sizes. And for our last dive watch here, we're going to look at the Omega Seamaster 300, not the Diver 300, the Heritage Seamaster 300, because of just its lug-to-lug dimension, its lack of a helium escape valve, its multifaceted case structure. It is a little thicker, and then also that lug-to-lug dimension of under 48mm. It wears like a 40mm watch. I think it's much more wearable than the 42mm Diver 300, and if you're somebody that's on the fence that maybe can't pull that watch off perfectly, I think you'll find this one more at home. I also think the bracelet, it does have larger links, but it is a bit more elegant in its approach and feels more modern despite, of course, this being a heritage watch. There's just something about the Diver 300's bracelet that is very 90s, that is a different type of flow in terms of what it is going for. Now we shift into complications. So GMTs, chronographs, what are some of the watches here? I did not include the Rolex Submariner, and it's not because it can't be a mass appealing watch and versatile watch. I just wanted to pick two other Rolex watches that I felt nowadays, if we're talking about watches that are new, I do not want to put the 214-270 here anymore because I do think that would have been on this list, but it is now no longer in production, and I don't think the 40mm Explorer does the same job as these two. First, we have the Rolex GMT Master 2. This watch is, to me, my favorite contemporary Rolex, your current in production Rolex. I think it is a watch that stands on its own within its segment as a GMT. It set the standard in many ways for its design style, but I want to specifically say on a Jubilee makes it even more viable for those that have smaller wrists because it's more forgiving in how it drapes around the wrist. 40mm case, it wears like a dream. I mean, just to also just throw this out there, maybe from a visual, like, could you imagine seeing a Pepsi GMT on someone's wrist and it not looking kind of cool? Like, I mean, it's pretty hard to not make this watch look sweet on wrist, both for its size as well as its just proportions, its mix of bezel to dial ratio. It's just a perfectly balanced watch in my opinion. And then the other Rolex watch I think is probably the most wearable is the Rolex Daytona, or at least the most viable for so many wrists out there. Now, the reason why the wait lists are so long is not because of its wearability, but it does maybe play a factor because this watch is so versatile in its looks, especially for a chronograph. Automatic chronograph on the inside, wearable lug-to-lug dimension. There's something also about the ceramic bezel that I think adds to the wearability factor for those that want to have something that is larger on wrist or feels larger or has more presence. Also, this is a watch that commonly is seen as like a couple's watch where pretty much like two people could share the watch and wear it at the same time. I know some people are like, oh, I would never share my watch with my significant other. But this is one that just works with so many wrists out there, and I think that adds to part of its charm. For the next watch here, this is a piece that I think you almost can't even put to words why it works. It just works. If you've ever worn this watch, you might know what I'm talking about, but this is the Omega Speedmaster Professional. This is a watch that I don't understand why it works so well. It's a 42mm watch, but for some reason, it just looks great on so many different wrists out there. It's not particularly the thinnest watch either, with the new 3861 on the inside, and especially with that dome crystal on these watches. It's very much leaning into that professional mid-20th century Speedmaster and being that moon watch. 47mm lug to lug, but there's just an element of the design and the proportions that bring this watch together, and also being a chronograph that I think aids in it. But it's so simple, and I mean that in the best way possible. It's pure in its design. But I think the two reasons why this watch works is the broken up aspects of the tachometer scale and the bezel, and then also dealing with that dial, and then finally the new bracelet helps this watch tremendously. The previous generation Speedmasters I did not find wore as easy as these because of the multi-link bracelet here. It's much more forgiving, it drapes to the wrist. I'm more of a 321 Ed White and First Omega in Space kind of guy, CK2998. But I can't even deny it. This was a watch when these were first unveiled, I tried it on, I'm like, oh man, these just work, and I think that's the case for so many people out there. Another one is the Longines Spirit Zulu Time 39mm. The 42 wore like a 42 on wrist. I mean, it wasn't a aggressively large watch, but it wasn't a small watch either. The 39 wears maybe right at 39, maybe you could say 39 and a half. It's in that nice sweet spot for people. 47mm lug to lug. Also why I think this is such a compelling watch is its thickness at 13.5mm. True GMT movement on the inside to get a 13.5mm thickness in this segment in a 39mm package. There's just a lot to like, and I think this is one of those watches, and why I think it was so important that Longines developed this was not only did it fill a void in the market, but it was one of those pillars that wasn't fully addressed. Now, Tudor has been dominating this segment for a long time, like $3,000 to $5,000. They have just been owning this and really gaining market share quickly. But this was the first big strike back, like just watching two prize fighters go at it. Someone's dominating all the rounds, and then you just see this strike back, and it just knocks you back on your feet. That's what this watch was in so many ways for Longines, and it delivered in giving, I think, people what they wanted, which was a very wearable for a wide variety of wrists, true GMT movement on the inside, and a package that is viable for so many wrists out there. Now, Breitling is not a brand that typically is a master of this type of idea of being viable for many wrists out there, but if there's one watch that I would focus on that can be viable, and it felt weird to put a specific odd Navitimer on this list, just because the Navitimer to me, there's so many different case sizes that is synonymous with it. And it's a watch that also was developed with this specific function with its aviation approach that it's hard to really look at it under the context of what is the right size, what's the most versatile size. But this is not the case for the Breitling Premier B09. This is a watch that is in the running for maybe my favorite Breitling watch currently in production. It is beautiful and it wears like a dream. 40mm diameter, 47.6mm lug to lug, and with that manual movement on the inside, that is also giving a huge benefit to the thickness. You're just around 13mm in thickness on this watch. I'm also getting 100 meters of water resistance. Beautiful dial, one of the most beautiful dials under $10,000, and it's more of just because of its color. It's just so unique. There's nothing really else like it that can mirror it, and the heritage design with it creates a beautiful dichotomy. Now we shift over to dress. So one watch I'll look at here under $1,000. I was struggling to think of some different dress watches. I was thinking about the Cocktail Times, but I could see many different case sizes there that people might mention. They're also a little bit thicker, which some people find a issue with. So I'm gonna go with the Tissot Chemende Terrell as a nice consideration because this is, to me, in a nice sweet spot. 39mm for a dress watch versus a different style of watch, I think are two different things. But this is a condensed 39 at 43.8mm. Reasonable thickness, and I think that's a good middle ground if you're trying to just pick that one size for a dress watch that could meet most people's needs. Now, this is a watch here next that is part of my personal collection. I wear it all the time. I love it. It's the Longines Heritage Classic Sector. I have the silver dial. Many people like the black dial. I think they're both great. 38.5mm case diameter, which is not small, not large. I think it's in a good spot. Lug to lug is a little bit longer, but a couple great things about this watch and why I think it's so great for many people out there If you're talking about the thickness, under 11 millimeters, pretty nice. So it's going to slide underneath the dress cuff, which is great. Wears a little bit longer than 38 millimeters. I would say it wears like a 39 millimeter on wrist. But the other benefit of this watch is how the lugs are going to feature holes a little bit farther up the lugs, so you're not feeling the full extent. And when paired with the bracelet, look at that black dial version, the bracelet drapes very well with that beads of rice bracelet. I'm so glad they paired this with the beads of rice. It is a stunning combination. It just feels like it's pushing forward a few decades in its age and making it feel a tad bit more modern, despite a beads of rice bracelet, which, you know, at its core is very much a vintage idea. So this watch I absolutely adore. Now the prices of these watches have gone up quite a bit in the last several years, which is a bummer because I remember when these watches were just even a few years ago, like $8,000 watches, if not less. Pre-owned were amazing points of value, but I even think now they're still maybe the best dress watch you can find around $10,000. They're absolutely in the running. This is the JLC Master Ultra Thin Moon. Why I like this watch, 39 millimeter case. I think that's a great size for a contemporary dress watch for those that are on the smaller side, could still pull it off, but for those that have larger wrists and don't like the anything under 40 millimeter crowd, this, because it's so elegant, is still viable. 45.8 millimeters with that lug-to-lug dimension. Being an ultra thin, you're talking about 9 millimeters, if not slightly thinner than that. 50 meters of water resistance, so not just the conventional 30 meters that you're going to find with many JLC dress watches. Comes together in a package that's beautiful, stunning, and easy to wear. This next watch is 38.5 millimeters, and I'm gonna give reason why I believe it belongs on this list. And that is the Longa 1. The Longa 1 is such an enigma for trying to classify it as why it works or how it's able to appear the way it does. You have this smaller case at the core of it. 38.5 millimeters is not the largest case out there, but for some reason this watch, you know those people that walk in a room and it just feels like it just lights up a room? Like, this is what this watch does to me. I think the fact that this dial isn't cluttered makes it feel bigger, if that makes any sense. Under 10 millimeters in thickness, 46.3 millimeters lug to lug, but all the elements, and also why I think this watch makes sense for a lot of people if you're talking about, you know, working on many people's wrists, all the dial elements are visible from across the room too. If somebody was wearing this on their wrist, you could probably tell the time. It's all so easy to detect. And then for the final watch here, a very similar theme, looking at a 39 millimeter dress watch. This is the Patek Calatrava, the 6119. The previous generations of Calatravas at this kind of style, this hobnail style design, you look at the 3919 and then the 5119, smaller watches. And that was basically the theme for this whole Calatrava family. Had more of this dainty approach, very classic. I thought that those watches in a way just had this timeless nature to them that did make them work. But this is more the modern approach, and I think for many of the norms nowadays, still also, like I talked about earlier, for those with smaller wrists, still can pull it off. For those with larger wrists, can be right at home. 8 millimeters in thickness, 46.9 millimeter lug to lug, so a little longer on that end. I would say it wears like a 39 millimeter when trying this on for the first time, but beautiful watch up and down. And I think many Patek watches often nowadays wear very large, or wear larger than you might think. Nautilus is not the smallest watch in the world. I find those watches wear huge on wrist. So this is something that Patek nowadays, it's getting larger and larger. This is still one that feels as if it could be pulled off by a wide variety and doesn't have this blingy nature to it. And you expect that from a Calatrava. It's not being overly ostentatious. It's just about looking the part when you do decide to look in that direction. But all right, guys, that is my list here today, looking at some watches that I feel could work for the majority of wrists out there. Again, this is my opinion. I try to give reasons why I feel these watches are viable for a lot of people out there, but if you disagree, you can leave some comments down below. There's some other watches that you would think would work for so many different wrists out there. Maybe if you had to put it on it, 80% or more of wrists, it could potentially work. That was my point of criteria. Leave your comments down below if you have some other watches that you would recommend for some other people. I could not include everything, of course. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Really would appreciate that. Also, check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. How we're able to support all this content and continue going is through selling watches on our site. So if you are in the market for a watch, I know you can buy a watch essentially anywhere nowadays, but we'd love to have your business, and it allows us to keep doing what we're doing here, and we love what we do. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.